Welcome back. You're listening to Back Talk with Sharona. As promised, I'm joined now by my good friend Jason Hirschorn. It's been too long since I've talked to him. We did a podcast. It's been maybe a couple of years, Jason. It's been way too long since we've chatted.
Yeah, it's been at least 2 years. So how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks again for finding the time to do this. I know that you've been really, really, really busy. We're going to get caught up, and I'm going to let you introduce yourself to the audience and tell everybody where they can find you and find your writing and stuff. So let's start with that. Tell everybody a little bit about yourself and where they can find you on social media, where they can find your work.
All right. Well, my name is Jason Hirshorn. You do not need to know how to spell my last name. I've made it so that you can find me on Twitter at @by_JBH. I'm an NFL writer for Sports on Earth and SB Nation. I'm also the senior writer and editor at Acme Packing Company, which is SB Nation's Green Bay Packers site. And this upcoming weekend, I will be at the Super Bowl covering it for Sports on Earth.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Super Bowl is going to be held at the newly anointed Levi Stadium, and not in San Francisco, but in Santa Clara, right outside San Francisco. This should be a great trip.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I've never covered an event of this magnitude before, so hopefully I don't screw it up.
Yeah, I had an opportunity to cover the NFC Championship game. That was the biggest event. Well, I don't know. The draft is kind of a big event. Well, which would you say is bigger, the NFL draft or the NFC Championship game?
I would say something with actual football that matters is probably bigger, but the draft certainly has plenty of consequences from it.
Yeah, they were both fun. I'll be at the draft again this year. Well, congratulations. That's awesome. Very well deserved. You're an excellent writer. You do a great job covering the Packers. And we're going to talk some Packers. And I'm going to get your thoughts on a couple of topics. We're going to talk about the Super Bowl, so that's great. I want to ask you also about Johnny Manziel. But let's start with some Packers talk. I'm a big Green Bay fan. It's kind of interesting that that in a down year like they had, and I don't think there's any question, but that they had somewhat of a down year offensively, they still made the playoffs, and they still had a great record.
Yeah, they won 10 games, and especially down the stretch, it was largely on the strength of that defense, which really had come into its own. Mm-hmm. Green Bay has really lacked on that side of the ball year in, year out since 2010, that being the season that they won the Super Bowl. But you really started to see some of their younger players step up into big roles, none bigger than Mike Daniels, the defensive lineman who got paid very handsomely during the year. He's become arguably their best player on defense. And when you have that kind of difference maker on your defensive line, it really changes everything behind you. That secondary also improved. They played very consistently, were able to do things they haven't been able to do in several years. So even though the offense struggled, and it really, really struggled mightily, the Packers, just in terms of pure yardage, which isn't the best way to measure these things, but just to give an example, hadn't performed this poorly since the late 80s. Like, we're talking about a strike year the last time they performed this poorly as a passing attack. So this really was a down year, and it kind of seems in retrospect a slight miracle that they were able to get to 10 wins.
Yeah, it was. I think you're right. Dom Capers gets a lot of grief, and rightfully so. He's there have been some head scratching things done by the coaching staff. We're going to get into that in a minute. I want to get your thoughts first of all, though, on the offensive side of the football. There were a lot of injuries at the wide receiver position. And the running game was up and down. Give us your thoughts on that and Aaron Rodgers' performance outside of those issues.
All right, well, let's start with the receivers. So it's usually not a good sign for any offense when they lose their number one receiver before the season even begins, which is what happened with the Packers and Jordy Nelson. He tore his ACL in the preseason opener. It didn't actually affect their offensive numbers that dramatically at the beginning. They were still able to move the ball fairly effectively. The big plays somehow were actually still there through the first 6 weeks, but they weren't really in the style you normally saw with the Packers. That's where that small sample size can be misleading. They were able to get some huge plays out of James Jones down the field, which is not James Jones' game if you know him at all. So when you have this full season, you saw they really struggled to move the ball down the field, and they really struggled to pass over the middle of the field because they also don't really have much of a tight end presence in terms of a guy who can really stretch the defense. So those issues really started to bog down that offense. The offensive line, which I know you didn't discuss, but I think it's very important here.
It is. We were going to talk about that, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. When it was healthy, it performed pretty well, at least in pass protection, not as much in the run, but we'll get there in a little bit. But they started to incur some injuries there, and really worse injuries than they've had in many years along the line. David Bakhtiari, their starting left tackle, had not missed a single game in his career until this season when he missed 3 full games and change. Then you had, at one point, the entire right side of their offensive line go down with injury, that being guard T.J. Lang, one of the better guards in the league, and Brian Bulaga. And when you have that many offensive linemen go down, especially when those injuries overlap the way that they did, it's really hard to have any offense work as well as it should. And given all the other issues that the Packers had, it really started to turn them into not even just an average offense, a below average unit.
Yeah.
And with the run game, as you mentioned, it really never got going at any point this season. You had a couple of games where Eddie Lacy looked like he was able to move the ball effectively. But if you're looking over the course of the entire year, the consistency wasn't there. The entire discussion this season has been about his weight and conditioning. Those issues are clearly valid because at the end of the season, Mike McCarthy said in a press conference, in a way that he never does with an individual player, Eddie Lacy cannot perform next season at this weight. So when you have a coach calling out a player, when he never calls out players individually to the press, it is signaling that there is a big problem there.
Yeah. There was a game, I forget, it was toward the end of the season, I forget which game it was, where Eddie Lacy was able, I think it was actually on a screen pass from Aaron Rodgers. It wasn't a run from scrimmage, but it was on a screen pass. And he's racing down the field, and by racing, I mean lumbering down the field. And a defensive player was able to catch him from a fairly good distance behind. Do you remember that play?
The reason why I don't remember this play is because there were many versions of this play during the season. Yeah. So this was a consistent problem for him. I mean, he's never been the fastest running back even at his best. That isn't his game. He's more of a power runner. Right. But there's a big difference between the conditioning he had in 2013, that being his rookie season, and 2014, and what he was like this year. I mean, it wasn't just that he was bigger. I mean, noticeably bigger around the waist. It was he just didn't move the way that he used to. His footwork looked slower. He wasn't able to move as often as he had in the past, and he certainly wasn't able to break away from defenders the way that he occasionally did in previous seasons.
It might have actually been the playoff game. It was as I remember, it was on a Saturday night, and Twitter was having a field day going back and retweeting all of his food tweets from the past, however long he's been on social media, on Twitter. And it was kind of funny. It made me hungry. I wanted China food really bad. Let me just say that right now. But
The play that I think you're referring to, if you said it was a Saturday, was the 61-yard run he had in Arizona, which, granted, 61 yards, that's not bad for anybody, but it was one of the slower 61 yards, one of the most plodding 61-yard runs that you'll ever see on an NFL field.
It was funny. I want to ask you about the offensive line. You mentioned the injury at left tackle. I thought the replacement did a pretty darn good job. Are there going to be any shakeups along that offensive line?
No, so at least not going into next season. David Bakhtiari, though not a premier left tackle in the way that, let's say, a Tyron Smith is in Dallas or like a Trent Williams in Washington, he is one of the best pass-blocking left tackles in the league. Okay. Now, he played through a ton of injuries this year, even before he actually missed time. I think at one point he was playing with 3 different torn ligaments in his ankle. That's a lot for any human being, let alone someone who weighs well over 300 pounds. Yeah. But he did a fairly admirable job. Now, the backup, the eventual backup, because they tried out Don Barkley and at one point shifted out left guard Josh Sitton to the blind side, and neither of those moves worked. J.C. Tretter did perform fairly well in his absence, but it was part of it being that matchup. Washington's pass rush isn't the best, and they rely on guys like Preston Smith, who I think is actually going to be one of the better pass rushers in the league down the line, but he's a rookie right now, so you can't rely on him to consistently beat a veteran, and J.C. Tretter's been in the league now for several seasons. And long term, I mean, David Bakhtiari, again, not the biggest offensive lineman by left tackle standards, but, he's 6'4" and change. He's got fairly long arms, and he's fairly quick on his feet. Whereas J.C. Tretter, though actually comparably as athletic, he is not nearly as big. He's just a little over 6'3". He doesn't have nearly that kind of wingspan. Like, those things are going to keep him from being a starting left tackle in the NFL. But when he's a free agent, not this offseason, but the following offseason, there's a reasonable chance that another team could come in and say, you know what, maybe he's not a tackle. This guy could start at guard or center for us. Now, keep in mind, he is Green Bay's normal backup center. That's something I could see happening.
Interesting. James Stark was good in relief. What's his status? Surely they're going to be looking at running back in the off season.
Well, we'll have to see. You know, James Starks in particular becomes a free agent. It is unclear whether or not the team will bring him back. He performed fairly well this year, turnovers aside. He did fumble way more than he had in the past. I believe he doubled his career fumble numbers in this season alone, which is bad for any player. However, he's definitely the faster of the Packers' two featured backs. He's certainly the better pass catcher, or at least got the better one after the catch. There's a good chance from that perspective that we want to resign him, but he's also going to turn 30 very shortly. Ted Thompson tends to stay away from signing players who are at or near 30 because of the likelihood that they are going to have injuries. So when it comes to the draft, I think there's a very good chance that they're going to look at running backs. I don't think they're going to do so early, at least not in terms of a feature back kind of player, because there is a chance that Eddie Lacy could shed, 20 pounds, get close to what his real playing weight is, and then become an effective player again, and they at least want to give him that opportunity. Plus, they have other backs, undrafted free agents that they've developed that look like maybe they could potentially give you something if given an opportunity. I think they wouldn't want to deprive them of that in the upcoming preseason or during the upcoming regular season. So if the Green Bay Packers are going to use a draft pick on a running back, I expect it to be late day 2, more likely day 3.
Okay. Another guy in that backfield, John Kuhn's a free agent too, isn't he?
Yes, he is. And even though I think a lot of Packers fans just assume that he will remain with Green Bay as long as he wants to play football, I would not be surprised if the Packers let him go. They spent a 6th-round pick last year on a fullback, Aaron Ripkowski out of Oklahoma. Played fairly sparingly on offense, though he did play a lot of special teams. He's a guy they're clearly grooming to be that successor at fullback. And given how little they're using fullback anyway, they like to use a lot of single back sets, shotgun, and pistol. I just expect at this point, barring something happening with Ripkowski this offseason, that they will allow Kuhn to walk.
John Kuhn's 33 years old. Do you think surely he'll get another opportunity?
Well, I mean, it depends. He's still shown that he's capable of doing certain things. He's still a good blocker. He's a very good special teams player. Those attributes bode well for him getting another contract. You also have to look at it this way. How many teams in the NFL still employ a fullback, like a true fullback? It's not many. We're talking about less than 10, which is less than a third of the league. So most of those teams already have their fullbacks if they're still using them. I just anticipate him having a little more trouble. Granted, he's playing the Pro Bowl as we're recording this conversation, so maybe someone says, let's at least give him a 1-year deal, see what he can do for us, but I don't think it's a slam dunk.
Interesting. You've got some free agents. The Packers have some free agents on the defensive side of the football. We'll get to that in a minute. Definitely overall a good season for the defense. What do you credit for that?
Well, there's a lot of things. They were able to improve the play of the defensive line, which had been an issue for them since at least 2010. It really was an area of weakness. Mike Daniels, we already discussed, he stepped up in a big way. B.J. Raji, after missing the 2014 season, really played well, and I think he's in line for a pretty decent contract, whether it comes with the Packers or somebody else. And they were able to get pretty sizable contributions out of former undrafted free agent Mike Pinnell, a guy who they played a lot at that other defensive or 3-4 defensive end spot. So when you have that much consistency along the defensive line and an improved set of linebackers, which they really had. Julius Peppers was even better this year than he was the season before, and Clay Matthews had really settled into that inside linebacker position. Because remember, in 2014, he only played about half the year there, and it was clear at times that he wasn't used to just playing from, frankly, those angles and just having to deal with those responsibilities. That wasn't the case in 2015. I think that's why the unit as a whole improved. Also have to keep in mind, most of the Packers' injuries this year happened on offense. The defense actually didn't really deal with too many undermanned units. Sam Shields missed some time. They had a couple of issues with some of their backup outside linebackers. That was really about it, though.
I was really big on Datone Jones coming out of UCLA. So far, a huge disappointment.
he certainly has been a disappointment for the role that they wanted him to play. They wanted him to be, if not a starting defensive lineman in that defense, to be a very effective situational pass rusher. Now, they started to use him this year, very interestingly, as an outside linebacker, not as a defensive lineman. But the second half of the year, I think he played more of his snaps at linebacker than defensive line, and then he really started to come on. I'm not sure if that's going to be a long-term thing. Maybe they simply thought they just needed to have a little more athleticism amongst those backup linebackers. But it seemed a little more natural for him, which was very surprising because when he was coming out of UCLA, he was playing in a 3-4 defense. He was playing in a 5-tech position. So to see him stand up and be fairly effective was a bit surprising. So I think there's still hope for Datone Jones, but he's going into year 4. He really needs to make a statement this upcoming season because then he's a free agent unless the Packers pick up his 5th-year option. And though they could, right now it seems more likely than not that they will decline it.
Is Julius Peppers an ageless wonder or not?
It seems that way, right? Like he never misses time. He continues to play well. I mean, he's going to be 37 next season. He's playing in an outside linebacker position in a 3-4 defense, which means he's playing a lot in space, which is something he didn't do very much for the duration of his career. And he seems like a total natural. Like you would not have predicted
he's
this in the Packers.
Yeah, he's absolutely fantastic. And so fun to watch. He really is a lot of fun to watch. B.J. Raji, he's a free agent. And a guy in your secondary, I would think they would be interested in locking up Casey Hayward.
Well, see, with Hayward, it's very interesting because he played, I would say, pretty well this season. It wasn't a great year. He's never been able to quite match the production he had as a rookie where he led the team with 6 interceptions. But the other thing about the Packers secondary is they drafted 2 cornerbacks with their first 2 picks in 2015 and then picked up an undrafted free agent who ended up making the team and playing fairly well, Ladarius Gunter. Those 3 guys, with also Sam Shields being there, Micah Hyde being there, it seems like it's a pretty loaded group without Casey Hayward. And Casey Hayward, I think, is going to command a fair amount of money when he becomes a free agent later this offseason. So for those reasons, I think it's more likely than not that he actually departs because the Packers have enough depth there that they can allow him to walk. And because if you're Casey Hayward, why would you accept less money to stay in Green Bay, which is what he would have to do, when you can, one, be a starting cornerback in an undisputed fashion somewhere else and make more money. It just seems like it makes more sense for both parties for them to depart.
He'll definitely get a lot of interest on the free market. There's no question about that. There are some interesting defensive backs who are poised to hit the free market. It's going to be fun to watch, see guys like Rashad Johnson, Casey Hayward, what happens with both of those guys. I meant to ask you this when we were talking about the offense. What are your thoughts on Scott Tolzien? Is he going to be the backup to Aaron Rodgers? Is he a guy that they could possibly hang on to and develop to be that number 1 guy?
You mean to develop to be the number 1 backup, or do you mean to be the starting quarterback?
Well, I mean, Aaron Rodgers sat behind Brett Favre for a number of years, and I don't know what we never know. Aaron Rodgers has been relatively healthy. He did miss some time not this past season, but the 2 seasons before that. At some point, though, and we're seeing it across the league, you better have a backup quarterback that you think has starting potential.
Well, the latter part of that I certainly agree with. It's always good to have a guy coming through the pipeline that could become a starter if either your starter retires, if he declines, or gets injured, what have you. Now, in the case of Scott Tolzien and the Packers, he's already fairly old by developmental standards. He's 28. He's also a free agent, so the Packers would have to spend a fair amount of money to retain him. And you also have to consider this. The Packers spent a 5th-round pick last offseason. They actually traded up on Brett Hundley, who ended up playing fairly well in training camp in the preseason. So if I had to guess,
I was a big fan of him coming out, as a matter of fact. Yeah.
I was mixed on him, but if you can get him on day 3, it seems like, especially if you're a team that knows how to develop quarterbacks, as the Packers do, that made a lot of sense to me. So I'm not sure if either of these guys are going to be a future starter for Green Bay because, even Aaron Rodgers is not young. 32, most of these superstar quarterbacks are playing well into their late 30s. If Aaron Rodgers plays, let's just throw out a number, 5 more seasons, I mean, Brett Hundley's already going to be off of his rookie contract. He's already going to be in his late 20s at that point. I just feel like the next starter in Green Bay most likely isn't on the roster. However, there are some people who think that Scott Tolzien might get a chance to be a starting quarterback next year if he signs with the team not named Green Bay. I'm not sure if that's going to be the case, but I didn't think it was going to be the case with Tyrod Taylor this past offseason. He turned out to be quite the find for Buffalo.
Yeah, he did. But it's interesting. Buffalo, the Bills looked hard at Carson Wentz and some of the other big name quarterbacks at the Senior Bowl. It's a quarterback thirsty league. That's the reason why I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Well, I'm curious to see what does happen with some of these. It's a good crop of quarterbacks coming out this year.
There's certainly a lot of guys being discussed as potential franchise quarterbacks, more so than we had the last couple of seasons. Though I would say there's no obvious slam dunk top quarterback selection the way we had in 2012, where we knew that it was going to be Andrew Luck, and we knew the next guy off the board was going to be Robert Griffin III. It doesn't seem that way this year.
Yeah.
A lot of people, myself included, think that the best quarterback here is probably Jared Goff, but there are certainly going to be people who have those same opinions about Carson Wentz. Possibly people have those opinions about Paxton Lynch too. And that's not even discussing Connor Cook and some of the other guys who could squeeze into that conversation as well.
Yeah, I'm very, very, very excited about this upcoming draft. We mentioned Dom Capers. I want to ask you about your thoughts on the coaching staff. Mike McCarthy took over the offensive play calling duties at some point during the season, and then he had some interesting things to say about Ted Thompson. So let's delve into that. First of all, coaching performance in 2015.
Well, in my opinion, this was a down year for the offensive coaching staff, a staff that has been very, very effective for almost a decade now. Mike McCarthy, as you mentioned, took back the play calling midseason. He had been the Packers play caller on offense since he got there. This past offseason decided to delegate those responsibilities to Tom Clements, the top offensive assistant. And after a relatively effective first 6 games, the offense just fell apart. And not all of that was on Tom Clements for sure. I mean, the offensive line had injuries, the receiving core had injuries. Aaron Rodgers apparently was playing with a knee injury. So when you have all of those issues, that can affect your offensive productivity. But there was also some issues where the Packers offense was becoming not totally predictable, but there were certain situations where they would enter, and the defense clearly knew what was going to happen, and they knew how to stop because the Packers weren't playing that well. That's when McCarthy took the play calling back. And even though the numbers early on weren't that much different than what Tom Clements produced, you saw by the end of the season that it got back to being some version, albeit a weaker version, of the Packers offense. They were playing with a lot of tempo. They were getting up to 65, 70 plays on offense against Washington in the postseason. I believe they had 67, 68 plays, which was the most they'd had in a long time. That's the kind of offense that they want to be. So I think when they made the decision to delegate those offensive play calling responsibilities, I didn't think it was necessarily going to be a bad decision, but I thought it was something that was going to be a potential risk, because McCarthy, though he has faults as a play caller himself, had run one of the most effective offenses over the course of about a decade at that point, and he was coming off a year where he had the number one scoring offense in the entire NFL. So to make that change at that point seemed a pretty big risk, all things considered, and ended up blowing up in his face. That wasn't McCarthy's only mistake this season. I mean, we saw for weeks when David Bakhtiari, the left tackle, was hurt, them going to Don Barkley, a completely overmatched offensive lineman playing left tackle. They tried Josh Sitton, who is one of the best, if not the best guards in football, playing out of position at left tackle. That also didn't work. It took until the playoffs for them to figure out that their best backup option there was J.C. Treader. I don't think that's something we can just brush under the rug. McCarthy's coaching staff has done a very good job in the past of identifying what's the best solution to a problem. That was not the case in 2015. So while I don't think this is one of the better coaching staffs in the league, I can't say that they did a particularly stand-up job this season.
I want to ask you, before we get to the Mike McCarthy, Ted Thompson thing, what is up with his health, Mike McCarthy's health? I said on my show last week, Winston Moss, the guy that I've always really liked, is coaching the Pro Bowl. I said that might be the only reason why I watched it. I ended up not watching it, and we're doing this interview. What are your thoughts on Winston Moss, and what is his involvement with he's assistant head coach, linebackers coach, as I recall. What really is his status? I've been told that he's sort of the coach in waiting. Is that accurate or not?
Well, he certainly interviewed for a lot of head coaching positions, but a lot of people have wondered if if Winston Moss, being an African American, has gotten him a lot of those Rooney Rule perfunctory interviews, not real interviews where teams are viewing him as a real candidate. I can't say for certain whether it's one way or the other. What I can say is that Winston Moss's role with the Packers has increased pretty much since he got there with Mike McCarthy in 2006. He was originally just the inside linebackers coach. When they had one of their coaches retire, instead of bringing in a new coach to take over the outside linebackers, they just turned to Winston Moss and said, "You're going to coach all of those players." And Winston Moss has done a fantastic job with them. I mean, that group had one of its better years in 2015, and on top of that, he's basically the third or fourth highest ranking coach on that staff after the head coach and after the coordinators. He has a lot of respect there. There's certainly going to be a chance for him to be a head coach at some point. The real debate is whether that's going to happen in the NFL or whether he would have to go to college for that to happen. But Winston Moss at this point, he just turned 50, which, while is much older than you or I are, that's still fairly young by coaching standards. He definitely has time to find a position, to find a head coaching job if he wants it.
Yeah, he's definitely young by coaching standards, and it's an interesting thing because he's been, I forget when he got the title assistant head coach, but he's carried that title for a while. What is Mike McCarthy's health thing? It sounded like they were saying it was a stomach thing.
Yeah, he had some sort of stomach illness, and doctors recommended that he not travel to Hawaii. I can't say how serious it is or isn't, but my guess is simply that it was enough of a concern that would have made that very long air flight uncomfortable for him, and it wasn't for a game that counted. It was for the Pro Bowl, so it was probably in everybody's interest for him just to stay at home and heal.
Okay. Well, so what do you think about the comments that were reported, I believe, by ESPN, Mike McCarthy? It sounded like he was criticizing Ted Thompson for not making more moves in free agency, and the Packers just typically don't. They don't go out and sign a lot. They prefer to build through the draft, and they've been largely, some of their draft selections have not panned out. That's true, but I would preface that with, a lot of guys coming out from college are simply more projects now than they used to be.
Well, let's really unpack all of this. Now, the original report was from Bob McGinn of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and it wasn't that McCarthy had told him anything, or at least not officially. It was he had sources close to McCarthy saying that the coach was fed up with the front office's stance on veteran free agents. Now, I don't have any inside information with this, so on some level we have to take this at face value. But I do think this report was misconstrued in a number of ways. Some people read this to say that Mike McCarthy wants Ted Thompson to make a big splash in free agency in March, this upcoming free agency period. That is not how I read those comments. I don't think that's what those comments actually meant. I think Mike McCarthy, assuming that this is an accurate report, is more interested in the front office using, street free agency, during the season, and then maybe in the second or third wave of off-season free agency to fill some of the holes that they have on the roster. So we're not talking about super expensive players, name players. We're talking about guys like Mason Foster, a veteran linebacker that was not re-signed from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but could have maybe stepped into Green Bay and played a lot of snaps, if not started for them at inside linebacker. He ended up signing a veteran minimum contract with Washington earlier this year, became their starter down the stretch, and played for them in the playoffs. Like that kind of signing, I think, is what those comments really refer to. Okay. In many ways, this is within the concept of what the Packers like to do with their salary cap. They don't. It's not that they dislike free agency as like a concept. Is that they dislike spending a lot of money, especially more money than players worth, to bring them in when they're not guaranteed. They're not guaranteed success with that player. They'll spend a lot of money on their own players, which by and large will come at a cheaper cost than spending on others. But with those, cheap veteran players, that doesn't really blow up your salary cap. You can still control your future. You don't have to mortgage, up future dollars that you're going to need at some point to resign future free agents.
Well, they certainly went out and got Julius Peppers, we mentioned, and Sam Barrington, another guy they picked up. He's performed very well for them. They went out and got James Jones, a guy who's familiar, with the system. Just to play devil's advocate, the flip side to that is you don't know what you have in your younger guys unless you play them.
Yeah, so the Packers, even if they did include some more veteran free agents in their long-term planning, are still going to be one of the youngest teams in the league, just the way that they operate. Most of their players are going to be either established veterans that built up their resume with the Packers themselves, or younger players on rookie deals that are really coming into their own. I mean, that's been the Packers' MO since Ted Thompson got there in 2005. Now, I think it is a little unfair to say that Ted Thompson has never dipped into free agency, even though he doesn't do it very often. You mentioned some of those things. Julius Peppers was actually a street free agent. He wasn't one of those unrestricted free agents that we think of. He was cut by the Bears, and I think that's one of the reasons the Packers went after him, because it wasn't going to factor into their compensatory pick, selection process, and that allows them to hold on to future resources. But he's also signed, more, not necessarily always veteran minimum, but guys like that. So Troy Guy on 2 off seasons ago, they brought in on a 1-year deal after he left Minnesota. He ended up starting for them because P.J. Raji got hurt. That's an example of a signing. When they won the Super Bowl in 2010, I mean, they signed midway through the year Howard Green, someone who'd been released by the New York Jets. And while he never started for them, he had a lot of impact plays, including in the Super Bowl, when he was the person who forced the bad pass from Ben Roethlisberger that was picked off by Nick Collins and returned for a touchdown. So Ted Thompson does do these things. He just doesn't do them very often. And
I agree with that.
Yeah, and perhaps that's what Mike McCarthy may want. Again, assuming that report is correct, he wants more of those. A couple more veterans sprinkled in, so that they're not playing completely unprepared guys who are just 21, 22, who are ready for those big roles.
I want to ask you about. We'll turn to some coaching hires outside the Packers, and then segue into the Super Bowl. I want to ask you about Ben McAdoo. He's had such a meteoric rise since leaving the Packers. He was Aaron Rodgers' quarterbacks coach, as I recall. What are your thoughts on him? I felt like it was a strange hire for the New York Giants.
Well, I actually thought that it was a very logical hire for them, but there's a good chance we actually agree a lot of things about it, because you're right. He really, I don't think he came out of nowhere, but he went from being a very low on the totem pole assistant to being an offensive coordinator in about 4 years. Before he was Aaron Rodgers' quarterbacks coach, he was the tight ends coach. It was a very different position. And then within 3 years, he was calling plays for Eli Manning and the New York Giants. The reason why I think that hire makes sense for them is because at this point in Manning's career, it's going to take time. I mean, it takes time for any quarterback to adjust to a brand new offense. He doesn't have that many more years left playing at a reasonably high level. And if you're looking at him as an individual, he had statistically his best seasons under Ben McAdoo in that offense. So I think it makes sense to, hold on to that offensive continuity, really making it so that Eli Manning can continue to grow in that West Coast scheme. And Ben McAdoo is a guy who, if they didn't hire him, had a very good chance of being a head coach hire somewhere else, potentially in Philadelphia, where they were looking at guys like Ben McAdoo. They ultimately hired Doug Peterson, a very similar kind of coach, only without the play-calling experience. So I think Ben McAdoo, he has a lot on his plate right now because he's stepping into not just a head coaching role, but a head coaching role in New York with that, with the biggest team in the city. That's a tremendous, tremendous task. But, I mean, even before he got the offensive coordinator position with the Giants, people were comparing him to Andy Reid's rise, a player who or a coach that also went from being a relatively unknown tight ends coach to being the head coach of, a major East Coast team within a few years. So I would say that there's a lot of reason, if you're a Giants fan, to be optimistic about this, but there is also a lot of risk, and there would be a lot of risk with any first-time head coach.
I am skeptical. I still feel like his offensive philosophy is largely unproven in the National Football League. Eli famously difficulty transitioning to it. The first year there, I understand the continuity argument. Interesting stuff. I had intended to ask you about the tight end position. To me, that was, and before we get too far from the Packers, to me, they've got to do something. They've got to figure out who they are at tight end and what they want to do. Don't you think?
Are you referring to the Giants or the Packers?
The Packers.
The Packers. It's certainly something that they would like to do, but this actually is not a particularly good year to be in search of a tight end. The draft really doesn't contain any of those uber athletic, first-round type talents. There might be someone you're willing to take in the second round, but there's not necessarily that stretch the field kind of receiving tight end. That doesn't have to be Jimmy Graham, but that kind of a player who can really line up in the slot, completely changes the way the defense approaches your offense and can just make big plays over the middle even when he has double coverage. It's going to, there's a couple of free agents that in theory could help them, but most of them don't really fit that bill, and the ones that sort of do are going to have so much attention paid to them in free agency as they're just going to take too much money for the Packers to consider them. So I don't really know what the Packers are going to do at that position, but you're absolutely right. Improving the tight end position is going to be a very important part of not only this offseason, but the next couple of offseasons if they don't do it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I know I jumped back, but I had intended to ask you about tight ends when we were talking Packers. What was your biggest surprise of the playoffs this year? And then we'll talk about the Super Bowl.
The biggest surprise with the Packers in the playoffs, or just the playoffs?
No, just the playoffs in general.
All right. Well, I would say there's been a lot of surprises. The biggest one, I think, is that we saw Denver survive the AFC playoff field without Manning really playing all that well. I mean, that defense is the best defense in the NFL, bar none. I don't think that's up for debate. And the fact they were able to produce so many points is why they were able to overcome Manning playing so ineffectively. But, I mean, if you watch those games, as opposed to just reading the final score, you know that those Broncos teams really didn't have control of the outcome until very, very late. Against the Steelers, I mean, if not for that fumble by Fitzgerald Toussaint, Pittsburgh almost certainly wins that game, and we're talking about another, one-and-done outing for those Broncos and for Peyton Manning. It's a totally different narrative than the one we actually have. So we'll have to see what happens in the Super Bowl. Manning we've seen Manning already this season pull out really great games. He hasn't been terrible the entire year, and having the week of rest I think is really going to help him. But, man, he's going up against a very good defense. I mean, not as good as his defense, but pretty close. It's a defense that specialized in turnovers. They led the NFL in that category this year. It's going to be really, really tough.
I completely agree. I wasn't giving Denver much of a chance in the AFC Championship game, and I didn't get a chance to really see a lot of the first half. I did get an opportunity to pay some attention to the second half, and the Denver defense is just playing on another level right now. For me, and on the flip side, you have seen Carson Palmer struggle. Maybe he does have that finger injury that seems to be floating around out there, that was causing him some difficulty. I didn't expect the Cardinals to play so poorly against Carolina, even though I know Carolina is a great football team. How do you feel the Broncos and the Panthers match up?
Well, defensively, both offenses are going to have a lot of issues because we already discussed how good the Carolina Panthers are at forcing turnovers. With the Broncos defense not that far off, they certainly are better at getting pressure than almost anybody in the league. And keep in mind, these are two pretty suspect offensive lines. I think both quarterbacks are going to be in for a bit of trouble. Even Cam Newton, who's playing like an actual Superman. Now, if you look at the other way, the Panthers, even when their offensive weapons aren't really playing as well as they should, which has happened many times this year, Cam Newton has been able to find some way of pulling things out. We have not really seen that from Manning that much this year. Usually Manning's actually the source of their struggles, not necessarily the thing that overcomes them. So considering that, I think there's a bit of an offensive advantage, or really just quarterback advantage with Newton, and that to me is the big deciding factor here.
I'm very curious to see how Denver chooses to try to defend Cam Newton, who is playing, himself playing on another level right now. But I said this last week, I don't think Cam, as good as the Panthers have been, and as good as some of the teams, they have played, the Seattle Seahawks, the Rams, the Cardinals, Cam Newton and the Panthers haven't seen a defense like Denver's yet, and it's to me that's the matchup of the game.
Yeah, it absolutely will be. Anytime Cam Newton's on the field, it's really going to require your attention because of all the different things that he can do.
Yeah.
And look, we've seen some of the best coaching, defensive coaching anyway, this year come out of Denver with Wade Phillips, his first year coaching that staff, or coaching that unit rather. It will be interesting to see what he tries because there are some ways that you can use Denver's aggressiveness against him. Von Miller, who's having a fabulous year, can sometimes be caught over pursuing. And the way you take advantage of that sometimes is with a quarterback who can get him to, really just drive to the backfield and just take off in his direction. Cam Newton definitely capable of doing that. So there are ways that they can exploit certain aspects of the Denver defense. But again, it's the best unit in the NFL. Maybe you can take advantage of them once or twice. It's going to be really hard to do it more than that. it's going to be one of the more interesting Super Bowls in that particular way that we've seen in a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to give me a prediction?
Well, I'm not going to give you a scoring prediction because I'm terrible at those, but I do predict that the Panthers are going to win.
I think it's going to be hard for Denver. The Panthers are playing at such a great level right now. They've got some injuries. We'll be keeping an eye on Thomas Davis and Roman Harper, some of their other injuries, but they're rolling so well right now. It's going to be hard for any team to beat them. Jason, it was such a pleasure. I really do appreciate it. Once again, tell everybody out there where they can find you on social media, find your work, and find your coverage of the Super Bowl.
You can find me on Twitter at @by_JBH. You can find my work at sportsonearth.com and at sbnation.com. I will be having a ton of coverage as relates to the Super Bowl, both before the game, during, and after. So I really hope you'll check my stuff out. And thank you so much for having me on, Sharona.
Thanks for coming on, and we'll definitely be tweeting out all the places that they can find you, and we'll retweet all that stuff out as Super Bowl 50 rolls around. Thanks again.
Take care.
All right, bye-bye.